Okay, welcome back to the program. It's our conversation segment now. Professor Kingsley Moghalu, a former Deputy Governor at the Central Bank of Nigeria, is joining me right now. Professor Moghalu, good to see you, and welcome back on the program.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for having me.
Yes, let's get started. I'm torn where I would start. Let me get your own perspective on what has been happening, at least in the last 2 weeks in the country. Speak to me about what you think.
Well, I think, the NSAS protests have been one of the most significant events in Nigeria's history. I think apart from the Civil War and perhaps June 12th, it certainly is, in my own reckoning, the most significant event. And how do I judge the significance of an event? I judge it by the continuing historical, political, and economic ramifications of that event. NSAS will continue to reverberate, especially politically and historically in Nigeria, because this is the first time that young people have stood up to demand, an end to various kinds of brutality, police brutality, and call for good governance in Nigeria. Many people assume that our young people simply spent all their time watching BB Niger, and many of us always felt bad about this. But it's very significant that in a moment that we did not anticipate, they rose up. And this is what happens. When a system is oppressive, which is what we have in Nigeria, we have a democracy, but the character of the state is one of impunity. It's not a state where the rule of law is respected. And we see this in the violations of human rights by the SARS unit of the police force. And so, now the youth have risen up. So I think it's a profound development with implications for Nigeria going forward. And I'm happy to discuss what I think those implications are.
Okay, Prof, let me ask you what you think the cost of a Nigerian life is. I had an interview also last week with one of my guests, and studying the situation of how this protest went, hoodlums invasion, looting, massive looting going on, the question that kept ringing in my ears was that of how much is a Nigerian life? What is the price of a Nigerian life? Do you put a price to it? What's the cost of a Nigerian life at this point? And it's also instructive to say, Prof, that this is not the first time we've heard of killings in the country. There have been killings in Benue State, there have been killings in the Northeast, there have been killings in the Northwest. There have been a lot of what the government tags banditry, which I really don't want to call it because it's terrorism also. So there have been killings in other parts of the country. But from you, what you're saying that this is quite significant. Does that negate what has happened in other parts of the country, while you also answer my question as to what is the cost of a Nigerian life?
Well, let's begin with the question of what's the cost of a Nigerian life. The truth is that life is extremely cheap in Nigeria, especially if you are an ordinary person, if you're a big politician, if you're a big wig in the government, then your life is worth something. The Nigerian state exists to service the interests of politicians.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, forgive me. The Nigerian state at this point simply exists to service the interests of crony politicians. It does not exist to provide security and welfare for its citizens. That's what we are looking at, because there is no social contract. And when there is no social contract, you cannot continue to expect the loyalty of the citizens, whether it's in northern Nigeria, where banditry is wreaking havoc on that part of Nigeria, whether it's in the south, where you saw most of the SARS uprisings. There's no way in Nigeria that life has value, the life of ordinary Nigeria. It's either taken away by disease, taken away by hunger and hardship, or taken away by police brutality or by crime. How could you have a unit of the police and you have armed forces and they're not able to stop Boko Haram for how many years now? 11 years. Boko Haram is still reigning and running rampant. They are not able to combat crime, armed robbery, and banditry effectively. But they're very quick to turn on young people. They're very quick to turn on ordinary citizens. How is it that law enforcement exists for the sole purpose of regime protection, but not able to protect the citizens? So this tells you that there isn't much value to the lives of Nigerians in the eyes of the state, those who are in power. So that's number one. Then let me come to the protest and the looting and the hoodlums. The protest, as we know, was quite peaceful, very peaceful. But what happened on Tuesday? Agents of the state, military or security, according to reports, started shooting unarmed civilians. This is a tragedy and a travesty. And of course, we know that hoodlums who were sponsored, I believe, began to come in to try to disrupt the protests. And then there was a second wave of hoodlums, which is the looting that we're seeing now. These lootings are uncontrolled. The first set of hoodlums were clearly instructed to come and disrupt the protests. So you have three things going on at the same time. And now that you have the uncontrolled looting, as you have had in the last couple of days, we now see things like COVID warehouses or reports of things called COVID warehouses, and people are looting. Why were these palliatives not distributed when the pandemic was at its height between March and July, when we had lockdowns? And people are trying to make excuses. There is no excuse, so it's unfortunate, that there is a real collapse of governance in Nigeria. That's just the problem. And it has very profound consequences for the country's economic prospects.
Professor Moghalu, if you take a look at how it has degenerated, we've seen, just like you said, suspected sponsorship of hoodlums invading the peaceful protests. My question is, who are those that were their sponsors? And the state is quiet on this. The state is quiet on fishing them out. Here in Abuja, Apo Traders Association have said that they've suffered losses in the tune of 200 million naira and over. There were gory sights here. Even last week, we had an AIT town hall here that we saw a man crying. You see a grown man crying over the losses of burnt cars here in Apo, in Abuja. We've seen shops looted, small businesses, people that are just coming up, even women that sell like wigs and all of that. Hoodlums enter to do what with wigs? So if you're taking a look at that, how does the state explain or begin to fish out those that caused that mayhem away from the peaceful protesters?
Well, it's a test of the government, which is saying that it is, which has said, the president has said that they're going to accede to the demands of the peaceful protesters. One of the tests of the sincerity of the government, in my view, is how they handle this question of the damage caused by the hoodlums. Are they going to compensate all those people whose cars and vehicles that they were selling and other merchants, are they going to compensate them for the destruction? Do they have insurance? Many of these small traders do not have insurance. So we have to see if there is accountability. Is there going to be accountability? Is there going to be an independent investigation of the shootings at the Lekki toll gate? These are the things. So we will judge, and I think we should judge the government by its actions, not by words. So that's what I can tell you for sure. That if we don't see any action to bring people to account for crimes committed, just know that state failure is ongoing. That's all you should conclude.
Characterize for me the response of the federal government so far. When the peaceful protest started, the protesters had the 5 for 5 demand. The federal government swiftly moved to say, okay, fine, they ended SARS. They came up with SWAT. They came up with all their initiatives. The federal government also told the protesters, just calm down. We will continue with the reforms of the police. Training is ongoing for the SWAT team. In fact, last week when we had our town hall meeting here, we had the former commander of SARS, and I asked him the question how long it takes to train a normal or a SARS officer, a former SARS officer. And he said, the training is almost haphazard. You just see policemen like 2 years in the service and they can be drafted. But what the IGP has put in place right now, the training is ongoing and may be rigorous than what we had earlier. So if you take a look at all of that with what government has done, how would you summarize the efforts and the response of federal government as well as states? Because the states should not be exonerated in all of this.
Yes, yes, indeed, Nancy. I think that it is too early to assess the efforts of the federal government, especially, and the states, because we have to, the protesters have put out some demands, and they said they will give timelines to the government. Government has to put timelines to its promises. I think that's how we have to know whether they're serious or not. If you're saying, I will reform the police, or I will reform this unit of the police, by what time? Over what period of time? So we don't want open-ended statements, vacuous promises. That's not what's going to solve the crisis of legitimacy, because the Nigerian state now has a fundamental crisis of legitimacy. This is what has happened with this EndSARS protest and the shootings at the Lekki toll gate. The Nigerian state is increasingly lacking legitimacy. And to restore it is going to take very strong action on the part of the government that is very clear, provable, identifiable, quantifiable. So I served in the United Nations for many years. And in the early part of my career, I was a human rights officer, I was a political affairs officer, and I was a legal advisor in the United Nations. And I undertook, state building and peace building in various countries that were coming out of conflict, like Cambodia, like Croatia, like in Rwanda. And, these were serious efforts. It took a lot of investment and it took time. It took at least a year to be able to train a police force to become a modern police force. The problem with the police is training, but it's not just training. What about recruitment? Is the recruitment really professional? What are the minimum standards? GCE? I don't know. So and then you have the question of equipment. Is there specialization in the police force? There are so many issues with the Nigerian police. Many issues.
I think we'll come back to the Nigerian police, talking about reforms in a bit if we have the time. But you talked about legitimacy, that the state lacks legitimacy. I want to understand what you mean by that.
Yes, I said the state is at risk of losing legitimacy in the sight of its citizens, because especially, not just because of the Lekki, the EndSARS protests, but because of the shootings at the Lekki toll gate, the response of shooting unarmed protesters. These are violations of international humanitarian law, and you're not seeing them acknowledged. Instead, they're being denied. How can citizens now believe government when everybody knows what happened? I was on an interview on Channels Television when the shootings began. The interview was interrupted, and the anchor said, breaking news, shootings at Lekki, and you were hearing the gunshots and seeing all sorts of flares. So, and then people have all sorts of videos. So this is the thing. Who do you believe? Does the citizen believe what the government is saying? That's what I call a crisis of legitimacy.
Prof, just let me button it. Why do you think that the government is in denial of this? Do you think there's an international dimension to it, especially as you have worked with an international agency such as the United Nations? You saw the clamor, you saw the support globally for the hashtag EndSARS protesters around the world, musicians, global leaders, everyone saying that police brutality should be ended in the country. So why do you think that the federal government was swift? Even in President Buhari's speech, there was no mention of like the Lekki shooting massacre. In fact, I think in one of the paragraphs he said so-called protesters. So what do you think that the government is dodging from an international perspective?
I think they're dodging from the consequences in terms of, possible actions of sanctions, by powerful, foreign countries. They're dodging from the possible consequences of visas being declined or withdrawn. Those kinds of things. Like I said, the Nigerian state today exists to service the political elite. It does not exist to take care of the citizens. That's just the truth. And the sooner we understand that, the better. What is the response? And that's where I would like us to discuss. How do we respond to this? Nigeria needs to be fundamentally re-engineered. Some people call it constitutional restructuring. I say we start with a new constitution. And that new constitution has to come out of something like a national conference, a grand bargain between the 400 ethnic nationalities that make up Nigeria about what kind of country we would like to be. What is our individual stake in it? What are the checks and balances to make sure that nobody dominates anyone else? It is only when and then how do we establish true federalism, where the subnational units can actually become economically productive and contribute a tax to the central government, which is very lean. Right now, the federal government is all powerful. 68 items on the exclusive legislative list are exclusive to the federal government. And that's not a real federation. So it is only when we can re-engineer Nigeria, restructure Nigeria, that the economy will begin to boom. Because right now, everything is just so top down when it should be bottom up. That's the approach we need to be moving into. What the NSAS shows is that there is need for these kinds of fundamental reforms, including police, devolving policing to regions and communities. That's the point. You can't have 200 million people and say you have 350,000 police for them. I called for a recruitment of 1.5 million policemen when I was running for president in 2019. Nigeria is under-policed. So these are the things, we have to really understand what NSAS means. Nigeria will never be the same again after this NSAS protest. I can tell you that. Before now, the politicians were the masters of the citizens, but that is changing because the youth, which has 60% of Nigeria's population, has found it in themselves to rise up. And then they were traumatized by this shooting at the Lekki toll gate. So there will be all kinds of reactions as we go into the future. So you have the youth from one side coming up, police brutality, governance. You have all people of all ages in Nigeria calling for constitutional restructuring. So we have to resolve the internal contradictions of the Nigerian state. That it is the denial of those contradictions, the reluctance to address them, that is leaving Nigeria in a quagmire.
Prof, do you think that the youths, as a result of what happened in Lekki, in Lagos last week, do you think that the youths have been, pushed to stay silent for a while? Have been, how will I put it now? I read something, Bloomberg came up with an article just a few days ago on the Next Africa newsletter. And they did say in that article that the government of the day has come up with military tactics which they were known for to, push and silence the protesters. It's on Bloomberg. Anybody can check it out. That that it hasn't changed. So do you think that young Nigerians are being silenced right now in a way as a result of what we saw in picture, what we saw on video, despite the different denials? That's the A part of the question. The B part of the question, which a lot of people have also said, is perhaps the young people were not a bit strategic because you cannot win the war alone on the streets. They were coming up with, we have a leaderless, is a leaderless protest, but how far can you go with leaderless protests? Yes.
Let me address the first part of the question about whether the youth have been silenced. They may be traumatized right now because of the shootings. Many people are mentally and psychologically scarred. No question about it. And that's sad. But I want to tell you that from this kind of trauma, is a very surprising kind of courage and determination can emerge. So nobody should count the young people out simply because they were shot at Lekki. And then if anybody thinks, you see, if you think you're going to be able to suppress the energy of the youth of this country without undertaking fundamental reforms in governance and in policing, and even in the constitutional arrangement of Nigeria, I think anybody in that kind of mind frame is deceiving himself. There is a historical dialectic that always unfolds. Oppressors always take the oppressed for granted. Always. They think they are so powerful because they have the instruments of force, coercion, But what happens is that always, at some point, the oppressed will always rise up. What will trigger it, when it will happen, we almost always never know in advance. Many people were not expecting this. But if you have to be educated enough in history and its dialectics to understand what I'm saying. If you're just, somebody who has come to power in a state that is not very effective, but you have captured the elements of power, you will think that nothing can happen, but things are happening. So I don't think the youth have been silenced, to answer your question in one sentence. And I think they will go off, they will go online, they will be thinking, they will be strategizing about how to go forward. Now, you talked about leaderless protests, and that's a very interesting question, whether or not they were strategic. One thing I can tell you from what I saw from NSAS is that the youth were extremely well organized. They were charging their phones on solar-powered panels. They had emergency hotlines for health, for legal services, for all sorts of things. They were cleaning up after themselves. I have never seen such organization, even in advanced Western countries, when it comes to protest. So you've got to give kudos to them. That is the peaceful protesters I'm talking about. Now, so they made a strategic decision that they will not have a formal leadership. And who knows why they made that decision? They have their reasons, because if suppose they had a formal leader immediately, we know how the state operates. They will either arrest that person, or they will try to compromise that person, or create divisions within their ranks. But these things did not happen because they didn't come up with a formal leadership structure. But I'm sure they were being coordinated somehow. Okay. There were people who emerged as leaders in the protest.
Prof, the question right now is, what's the way forward even for the protesters? Because like I asked earlier, that you can't just win it on the streets alone. Now yes. They are not protesting anymore. Hoodlums have started looting again everywhere in the country. I'm not sure they are protesters. They are not protesters, what we're saying. So what strategy should the youths come forward with?
Nancy, the question is, why are these hoodlums looting without control? And the Nigerian state is unable to control them. What does that say? That people who are violating the laws, the people who commit crimes, are not being controlled, but you're able to shoot protesters who are protesting peacefully. That's the real issue. Why is it that Boko Haram is thriving? Why is it that the bandits are thriving? And we supposedly have national security in Nigeria. So does it mean that the strength of the national security only is evident when it comes to peaceful protest, but why it's not evident against criminals and terrorists? That's the fundamental question.
Prof, the question also would be for the police officers, because it seems that NSAS, the first and foremost demand from the protesters was about stop killing us, end police brutality. We don't want the harassment, we don't want the injury, we don't want the alleged deaths and all of that rape that goes on with these people. The IGP has come up with different efforts. But the question is, the police are also scared themselves. Because yes. Just like you said earlier, and I got that from your statement, that it's more of a constitutional review or reform that we should do. So perhaps the hashtag NSAS is a symptom of a bigger disease, just like coronavirus is. You can have headache, you can have cough, you can have fever. They are all symptoms of a disease. So how do we approach the police?
Nancy, NSAS is a metaphor for much deeper and broader issues of Nigeria as a nation, as a country. Whether Nigeria is in fact a nation. It's a country, all right, but is it a nation? If it is a nation, or even if it's a country as it is it working? It's not working for anybody. Whether you're in Karanamoda, Sokoto, or Ibadan, or Newi, Nigeria is not working for most of its citizens. So we have to go deeper than just police reform. Police reform is the beginning, because that's the reason for the protest. So I think the youth should now engage the government in a process of negotiation. The government often tends to be very patronizing and condescending to young people in Nigeria. And I would advise them to move away from this mindset and take the youth seriously. Bring them into the discussion, not in a tokenistic way, just to fulfill all righteousness. No, change the way you approach things for once and see if you will not get better results and establish trust. So I know that the young people, I saw statements that they've put out calling for nominations for people who will represent them in negotiations with the government, who will advise them and things like that. I think we'll be hearing a lot more from the NSAS protesters in the weeks and months to come. I don't think this is over yet, but what we need to do is to restore calm. We don't want violence in any dimension, but peaceful protest is a constitutional right, and it should not be put down with violent and arbitrary executions, extrajudicial executions. That's wrong, and that's why there's a crisis of legitimacy today. Victims compensated, and there must be accountability.
Yes, COVID-19 palliatives, we've seen hoarding of it in different warehouses across the country. For me, when I saw those pictures coming in social media, in fact, a few people also called me, I was livid, because I remember that in the heat or in the middle of that lockdown we had, I think from March till about July till it was softened, I was in the midst of analyzing this day to day, even the COVID people, speaking to them regularly on what is being done, COVID-19 palliatives. And the pictures that I've seen aren't encouraging at all. People going into the warehouses, taking those foods, and they don't say they are stealing it. They say it's our own. See what would have been given to us. Some food products have expired. Some have spoiled. And there's no explanation. Some of the explanations I've seen, laughable explanations as to the poor people in our midst need this food, need this thing to help them, cushion the effect of COVID-19, which we are not out of yet. What's your perspective on that?
Well, Nancy, there's nothing much to say other than the truth of the matter. A lot of what we call governance in Nigeria is nothing but a glorified criminal enterprise. I've said this before. I put it out on social media. I'm sorry, but if you are supposed to deliver palliatives to Nigerian citizens and you hoard them and store them in warehouses, meanwhile, people are very hungry. They're jobless after months of COVID lockdowns. What are we to say? This is a criminal enterprise of another sort. So we can blame the looters, but you have to see that there is a fundamental crisis of legitimacy here, which is from where we started this conversation. Now, what does all this mean, for example, for the economy? We were already suffering from COVID, suffering from the oil price crash, and now you've had this NSAS with weeks of lost economic productivity against the background of a 6% contraction of the GDP. It affects the foreign investment climate, because it introduces a political risk element, an additional element of political risk that investors have to. I advise a lot of global investors who are interested in Nigeria or doing business in Nigeria, and I help them to manage their risks. So this is one factor they also have to look at. What is the political situation in Nigeria? Is it really stable with these kinds of things going on? Then we already had youth unemployment, which was a big issue, and so the economic prognosis is not good. But the reason the economic prognosis is not good, and I've said it a lot, is that you cannot fix the economy of Nigeria without fixing Nigeria's politics. It's impossible. Because the Nigerian state, there is no incentive for good governance in Nigeria with the constitutional structure of the Nigerian state today. Every incentive exists for rent seeking, for desperation to capture power at the center and be an all-powerful winner-take-all for 4 years. That's what it is about. So except Nigeria is fundamentally constitutionally redesigned for progress and for economic productivity, we're wasting our time, because all the incentive today that exists is to export crude oil and live off its rents. And when you're not getting enough money for it, what we have now is, borrowing. We're borrowing like drunken sailors. Not spending like drunken sailors, but we are borrowing like there's no tomorrow. You know? And that's the point.
Now, Prof, in 2 minutes, give me some of the solutions in case perhaps government hasn't thought of it, or perhaps to fine-tune what government is doing. Last week, President Buhari met with former leaders. With what I'm seeing right now, I think there's an emergency NEC meeting or so ongoing at the Villa. What steps do you think that the government should rapidly take? And when I mean government, I don't really talk about this FG, federal government. Let's also speak to the center, to the subnationals.
To the states.
Yes. Then what also is your advice to young people in 2 minutes?
Yes. Now, I believe that the first thing that the federal government and the states must do is to on creating jobs, some sort of jobs or some sort of income for young people, and to support small and medium enterprises by young people and women in the country. SMEs are 96% of Nigerian businesses, and 84% of the employment workforce is really SMEs. So investments into that part of the economy, especially with all this money that is being borrowed, a lot of it should go to how do we get out of the COVID crisis? What do we do for the young people in this country? How can we help them start new businesses? How can we train them over the next 1 year, train them in various productive skills and invest, give them money to start new businesses? I think that should be the utmost priority, because when you have an army of young people who are unemployed and hungry and poor, you're asking for trouble down the line. You have a youth bulge. That's the first priority. The second thing I believe that should be done, the government should stop borrowing. When you are in a hole, the first thing you must do is to stop digging. Otherwise, you're digging yourself into a bigger hole. The government should stop borrowing. There should be a moratorium for now on any further borrowing. And then what do? You must reduce the bloated cost of governance. Can we have the National Assembly's remuneration slashed into 2 by half? Can we have a lot of the expense that goes out to carry the political elite infrastructure of Nigeria? You would have a lot of savings to put into healthcare, to put into employment schemes. And then longer term, the government must immediately signal that it is ready for the constitutional restructuring of Nigeria. That's the only thing that will restore calm to Nigeria. Let's sit around the table and discuss Nigeria and how it can prosper. If the government does not signal that, we're only seeing the beginning of trouble.
Prof, I think we need to leave it at that point, because quite a lot of issues to discuss that we can't finish within an hour show. But thank you for your thank you for your perspectives, and thank you for waking up early for me today. It's about 7 a.m. over where you are, so thank you. But your day has started, Prof. I don't think you go back to sleep.
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for having Yeah. All right.
All right. Thank you, Prof. I've been speaking with Professor Kingsley Moghalu, who was the former Deputy Governor at the Central Bank of Nigeria. And we've been looking at the hashtag EndSARS protest, the way forward, counting the losses, and it's not a good time for our economy at this time. All right, that's the much we can take. I am Nnaji. Please join me again tomorrow on another edition on this channel, Africa Independent Television. The news is up next. Thank you for watching our video. Please hit the subscribe button below, turn on post notification to follow all our updates.